You're standing on the seafloor, 1,000 meters below the surface, in complete and total darkness. There's no sunlight down here, there's barely any food, and the ground beneath you is basically just a nutrient desert. And then out of nowhere, the water above you starts to darken even further. Something massive is falling toward you, and a second later, a 40-ton corpse slams into the seafloor next to you. This is a whale fall, and while it looks like the end of something, it's actually the beginning of one of the most productive events in the entire deep sea. So how does one single death manage to feed an ecosystem for decades? What actually happens to a body this massive when there's no one around to clean it up? And why do some of the animals that show up here exist absolutely nowhere else on Earth? To understand why a dead whale becomes such a big deal, you first have to understand just how empty the deep ocean actually is. Past a certain depth, sunlight can't reach anymore, which means there's no plants, no algae, none of the stuff that normally forms the base of a food chain. Almost everything down here survives off of marine snow, which is just a slow trickle of organic scraps falling from the surface. It's barely enough to survive on. So when a 40-ton whale carcass drops out of nowhere, it's not just a meal. It's the equivalent of thousands of years worth of marine snow arriving all at once. And whale falls aren't exactly common either. Most whales that die actually get eaten by scavengers near the surface, or they get so bloated with gas that they never even sink. Only a small percentage of whales ever make it all the way down intact, which means for the animals living in this part of the ocean, a whale fall is basically a winning lottery ticket. But once it lands, what actually happens to it? The first stage begins almost immediately, and it's brutal. Within hours, sharks and hagfish start showing up from the surrounding darkness. Sleeper sharks are usually the first predators on scene, and they'll tear directly into the whale's soft tissue, ripping off huge chunks of blubber and muscle. Hagfish, which are these eyeless, jawless, almost eel-like scavengers, will actually burrow straight into the body and eat from the inside out. This first stage is called the mobile scavenger stage, and it can strip up to 60 tons of soft tissue off a whale in a matter of months. For comparison, that same amount of decomposition would take years on land. But in the deep sea, where meals are this rare, animals move fast when there's finally something to eat. After the soft tissue is gone, you'd think the whale fall is basically over. But this is actually just the beginning. Once the flesh has been stripped away, a completely different group of animals shows up. This is called the enrichment opportunist stage, and it can last for years. Worms, crabs, snails, and tiny crustaceans start colonizing the leftover bones and the surrounding sediment, which has now been completely saturated with nutrients from the decomposing body. The seafloor around a whale fall becomes so nutrient-rich that scientists have found sediment here with organic matter levels comparable to a thriving coral reef in an area that would otherwise be almost completely barren. But here's where it gets stranger. Even after the bones have been picked clean of any visible tissue, the whale still isn't done providing. Because whale bones themselves are absolutely packed with oil and fat, embedded deep inside the bone structure itself. And this is where the final and strangest stage begins. This is called the sulfophilic stage, and it can last for decades. Bacteria move in and start breaking down the fat locked inside the bones through a process that releases hydrogen sulfide, which is normally a toxic gas. But instead of poisoning the area, it actually powers an entirely separate ecosystem built around chemosynthesis instead of sunlight. Chemosynthetic bacteria use that hydrogen sulfide as an energy source, the same way plants use sunlight. And this creates a bizarre, self-sustaining bubble of life that can persist on a single skeleton for anywhere from 50 to potentially over 100 years. But this is where the whale fall pivots from impressive to genuinely bizarre. Because some of the species that show up during this stage don't exist anywhere else in the entire ocean. The most famous example is a genus of worm called Osidax, otherwise known, and I promise I'm not making this up, as zombie worms. Zombie worms have no mouth, no stomach, and no digestive system whatsoever. Instead, they grow root-like structures that bore directly into whalebone, and they use bacteria living inside their own bodies to break down and absorb the fat and oil trapped inside. They were only discovered in the early 2000s, and multiple new species have been found on nearly every whale fall scientists have studied since. There are entire species of clams, worms, and bacteria that, as far as we currently know, only exist on whale bones and nowhere else on the planet. Which raises a genuinely strange question. If these species only live on whale skeletons, how do they even find a new one? Whale falls can be hundreds of miles apart, and they're incredibly rare. This is actually one of the most fascinating parts of the whole process. Scientists believe whale falls act as stepping stones, spread out across entire ocean basins, allowing certain deep-sea species to slowly migrate and colonize distant regions they'd otherwise never be able to reach. Some of these organisms release larvae that can drift for extended periods, waiting to detect the chemical signature of a decomposing whale nearby. Without whale falls acting as these scattered checkpoints, some of these species might not be able to survive at all, which means whole populations of deep sea life may be quietly depending on a network of scattered whale skeletons that most of us will never even know exists. So by the time you add it all up, a single whale death ends up supporting hundreds of different species across multiple overlapping stages for potentially over a century. A single animal's death outlives the animal itself by an entire human lifetime, and sometimes even longer. And when you really think about it, that whale spent decades of its life traveling across entire oceans, feeding, growing, surviving predators. But its most important contribution to the ecosystem might not happen until after it's already dead. In life, it was just one whale swimming through the water. In death, it becomes the foundation for an entire miniature world. The deep sea looks like one of the most hostile, empty places on the entire planet. But every so often, out of the darkness, something falls. And for the animals lucky enough to find it, that single death might be the difference between barely surviving and thriving for the next 100 years. Thanks for watching. If you want to see the video about why sperm whales are the ocean's most